as well as infill and redevelopment. Currently, we are in phase 2, and we're looking at, we're currently working on drafting policies and strategies that will support TOD activities. So our third phase will be preparing the station area planning for Palm Avenue, which is part of the streetcar extension. Next slide, please. So the purpose of our workshop today is to share what we've learned with you guys and to really hear new ideas and new perspectives, to really understand how you feel about what we've learned. Are we really on the right track? Do you really see your neighborhood growing like that? Where can we improve? And how can we improve? We really want your feedback. So we want to learn ideas about the future of the communities along the corridor. Next slide, please. So our agenda for today are, we're going to go through some meeting logistics. We're going to talk about what TOD is. We're going to give a study update. We're going to look at planned strategies to improve TOD, to create this TOD environment within the study area. We're going to give you some time for discussion, and then I will go ahead and close it out. All right, I will hand it over to you, Michelle.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. So we have two ways of providing feedback during this presentation: the raise hands feature and the chat feature. If you can please take a moment to find these features on your screen. They're on the right-hand side. We have a little screenshot there of what your screen should look like and where these features are. The chat window will open when you click the chat button, and we're asking if you can please send any comments and questions to all panelists so that we're sure that we can all see it. We'll be taking breaks throughout the presentation to address those comments, and Nicole will be reading them. And then later on in the presentation, we'll be doing a discussion portion where if you'd like to speak, you can use the raise hand feature. And we'll be queuing people up to talk, and we'll unmute you when it's your turn. If you're having any trouble with video or audio, there's call-in information in the meeting invite. You'll be able to just join using your phone. And if you have any issues, please email me. I'll be keeping track of that as well. My email address is there, and I will put that in the chat for all to see. Next slide. Steve, you're muted.
Naturally, I'm muted. So I wanted, before I jump into the presentation, just to talk about the format for a second. So the presentation, I'm going to hustle through a lot of slides relatively quickly, so I want to get through this in about 30 minutes. We'll take a couple short breaks during that time to answer questions that you enter into the chat. So Nicole is monitoring the chat, so if something comes up and you want us to pause for a second and provide some clarification, we'll do that. If it's a more complex question or might require me to bring some of our team members to the table to answer it, we'll hold that for the discussion. So think of the kind of questions or comments you have to share with this audience and with us during the discussion session, and think about whether you want to raise your hand or use the chat feature. So I'll dive into the presentation. So the first question is, what is TOD? So we're always cautioned about using our planner jargon when we talk about projects like this. So let's explain that really quickly and put that behind us. So TOD stands for Transit-Oriented Development. These transit-oriented developments or transit-oriented communities are places designed to capitalize on access to enhanced transit. When we think about what makes a successful TOD, they have several of these shared qualities. They're walkable and connected places. They're places that encourage walking as a realistic alternative to driving, to get around, to meet your daily needs. They are designed with pedestrian-friendly streets, buildings, and public spaces, so that walking is a real choice and a real attractive choice to hopping in a car, to access transit, to access work destinations, and to meet your daily needs. The TODs tend to be denser and more diverse than what's around them. So these are places that provide the things you need to go about your business in pretty close proximity. So so a little bit more density and a little bit more diversity in uses to allow for walking as a realistic alternative to driving. The density and diversity create places that serve community needs better, increases levels of sustainability, and expand access to opportunity. TODs are designed to serve changing needs. So TODs offer a range of housing choices to meet different market demands and different household types, and we're seeing a real significant increase in the diversity of what people need in terms of housing and in terms of their neighborhood support services. And we expect that to accelerate over the next 10 to 20 years. So rather than just single-family homes or rather than small apartments, we need a lot more diversity in our mix of housing across the community, and these transit-enhanced or high-quality transit corridors are the perfect places to deliver that diversity. Context is really important. So TOD is not a one-size-fits-all idea about the scale of development, the look and feel or the character of development. Successful TODs need to fit their context. So we really think carefully about what land is available to support that new development or different kinds of development and how that fits with the surrounding community. And from HART's perspective especially, is build ridership. So research over the last 30 years plus shows that TODs increase transit use. That if we can make it easy to get to transit, we can make it easy to walk to meet your daily needs, ridership increases, and that supports the public investment in those improved services. So I'm going to walk you through where we stand in the study now. We've done a lot of homework over the last several months, and that's been documented in the reports that I'll talk about in a second. But what we're trying to do overall is answer this basic question. What does new transit service mean for communities along the corridor? We've tried to answer that question, at least start to answer that question, through a series of research tasks we've undertaken. We've developed a context assessment, which is a thick document that documents existing conditions along the study area, and then a briefing book, which provides a higher level summary of that material. The transit investment that we're talking about that generates this opportunity for change and improvement are two projects: the HART arterial BRT study and the Tampa streetcar extension project. The arterial BRT study is higher capacity, higher frequency transit service along the project corridor, and I'll talk about that corridor in a second, that would connect communities between USF and downtown Tampa. The streetcar extension project extends the existing line through the core of downtown up to Tampa Heights, and these two systems will actually overlap for about 1.5 miles of the corridor between Palm Avenue and the central portions of downtown Tampa. This map shows where those lines exist. So the yellow on the right-hand side of the screen is the streetcar and the streetcar extension project. So you can see how these systems overlap in downtown up to the south end of Tampa Heights. And then you can see on this, the blue lines and the circles are the BRT corridor alignment and the primary stop locations. And these connect downtown, Tampa Heights, Seminole Heights, the neighborhoods north of the river along North Florida Avenue and Nebraska Avenue, and then the communities along Fowler Avenue over to USF and the VA hospital. We've looked at the conditions along the corridor through a number of different lenses, some of those traditional, some a little non-traditional. But the basics is really looking at land use and development conditions along the corridor. And what we have in a lot of places along the corridor are different levels of stability of neighborhoods that are within walking distance of the stops, and then the frontage has a really wide range of conditions from downtown, highly urban, highly walkable, more diverse, to Tampa Heights and Seminole Heights, which is really smaller scale and a lot of auto-oriented development, to the north end of the corridor, which has more conventional suburban development. And I'll talk about a little bit more about what that means in a minute. We look both at what's projected for the future of the corridor in terms of the amount of growth. So there's a significant amount of growth in the pipeline for both population and employment. So we can see there's a lot projected for downtown. There's a lot projected for the north end of the corridor. We've also looked at the communities that are along the corridor now, and we tried to understand better what the conditions are of those communities, who stands to benefit, and who's at risk of change along the project corridor. So we looked at a series of indices of equity to try to understand the different needs of communities along the corridor. We drilled into a couple of those to look at the relative levels of poverty along the corridor to understand better how people could benefit from this regional accessibility, better access to jobs, better access to services, but also the folks that were dependent on transit now. So we looked at the percentage of zero vehicle households. So that map with the shades of green, those darker greens are locations where a very high percentage of the households in that area have no cars under their ownership. So they rely heavily on transit, walking, and biking to get to work and to meet their daily needs. So it's important to understand the potential benefits of this project, but also how investment could affect their future. What we have along this corridor from downtown, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, to the northern suburbs on the left-hand side of the screen, is basically the history of development across Tampa and Hillsborough County. From highly transit-oriented, walkable, bikeable, transit-friendly downtown, to the very auto-oriented, not very walkable, not very transit-friendly destinations to the north, and everything in between. So we've got the early streetcar suburbs and the traditional Main Street conditions that exist along North Franklin, patches of that north on Florida. We've got the mid-century Main Street conditions, so the very, very beginning of suburban development forms along Florida. Then larger scale as we move north of the river, and then University Mall represents kind of the peak of that 20th century suburban development pattern with the very large footprint sites surrounded by parking. So we have all of these different contexts we need to deal with in the study. When we studied that, we were trying to understand where the opportunities were for change. And this map summarizes that in two basic colors. The pink are residential neighborhoods. So these are places we're looking at focusing on conservation. We're focused on neighborhood improvement and neighborhood livability. The areas in the pink are commercial, some vacant, some underutilized commercial, non-residential sites along the corridor frontage, and you can see where those opportunities exist in big pulses. So that's in downtown and just north of downtown, north of the river on the larger scale suburban sites, along Fowler and up by USF and Tampa. So we have not just different opportunities by neighborhood, but different opportunities by types. So urban infill and redevelopment downtown, smaller scale incremental infill and adaptive reuse in Tampa Heights and Seminole Heights, and then larger scale opportunities for suburban retrofit to the north along North Florida, Nebraska, and Fowler. So the strategies, I'm going to spend the bulk of the presentation on the strategies. Let me pause for a second here, Nicole, and see if anything is coming in the chat, if we need to pause for any questions.
No questions so far, Steve.
Good. So let me get through this section, and I think I'll spend about 20 minutes, and it'll keep us on time. We're starting to develop our strategies for how we guide development and reinvestment and improvement along the project corridor. And we're thinking about those strategies falling into three major categories. We're looking at ways to improve walking, biking, and access to transit, to promote housing affordability and diversity, to meet changing needs of existing households and new households along the corridor, and encouraging transit-oriented development while also protecting neighborhood character. So this is not just about new development, but it's also about how that influences the existing communities along the alignment. So the first question, how can we make it easier and safer to walk and bike along the corridor and to transit stops? We start with a really challenging environment. And the slide on the left tells most of the story of the conditions along the corridor. The scale is a little bit different, the context is a little bit different as we go from south to north, but we're dealing with a number of locations with sidewalks that are generally narrow, in poor condition, with no distance between sidewalks and travel lanes on the adjacent roadway. So this is not a great place to walk. It's a pretty uncomfortable environment, and it's really difficult to imagine people adopting transit and walking as their primary ways to get around when we deliver this sort of environment for them to do it in. So we're looking at this transition from the image on the left-hand side of the screen, the existing conditions, to the planned conditions, where we've got more comfortable sidewalks, pleasant ground floor buildings that define the edges of those sidewalks and streetscapes, some shade and some buffer between the sidewalks and moving traffic. We're also looking at crossing the corridor. So the other challenge along this corridor is the distance between signalized pedestrian crossings. So those are the places where you can stop traffic and cross the street safely. But they exist at fairly great intervals when we get north of downtown and north of Tampa Heights. And this map just highlights that point, that in many locations along the corridor, you've got to travel a half a mile to your destination if it's across the street and you're not at a stop location, a signal location. So that's one of the specific challenges that really limits the potential for people to move from place to access transit. And that's one of the things that we need to tackle. We're looking at a whole range of strategies for improvement. Some of these that we're taking on as part of this study, some of these are being taken on as part of the HART's arterial BRT study. So the BRT study itself will include a series of recommendations about improving pedestrian accessibility to proposed transit stops. And we're working together with that team to make sure that we're in alignment about what the right approach is. So these fall in a few different primary categories: speed management, improving pedestrian facilities and mid-block crossings, improving bicycle facilities, and then delivering some of those improvements through improved development regulations. I see we have a comment in the chat, but why don't we hold that, Nicole, until we get to the presentation, if that makes sense for you?
Sure, no problem.
Okay. So the second question, how can we protect existing housing affordability, encourage new affordable housing, and increase the diversity of housing options? We have a firm, SB Friedman Development Advisors, who's supporting us in this portion of the effort that focuses on the existing market conditions and the ways that we can understand how to deliver housing within that context. So we've completed research to understand market pressures and the potential for displacement as transit impacts local and regional accessibility and starts to change market dynamics across the corridor. We're focused really heavily on rental because most of the affordable units are rental units, and they fall into three basic categories. There's the legally restricted affordable housing. So those are projects that have received some public benefit or public subsidy, and they're held affordable for residents that qualify. There's the natural occurring affordable housing, or NOAA, and I'll use that term a couple times. But that's the existing housing that's accessible to folks in lower income categories. And the next map will explain the locations for that and sort of help us understand where to focus our energy. And then obviously higher rent housing exists along the corridor, and that's primarily what the market is delivering now. So what we have is the headline here is the affordability that exists now is at risk. There's limited presence of the naturally occurring affordable housing units in the southern end of the corridor. And if you know the corridor, you know that the market's changed significantly in Tampa Heights and in Seminole Heights over the last 10 plus years. What we see is the highest percentage of renter-occupied units and no units are in neighborhoods north of the Hillsborough River. And these are the places, if we're going to think about protecting the naturally occurring affordable units, we really need to focus on the future of these neighborhoods. To think about investments and strategies and planning tools that help support existing homeowners, that support existing folks in the existing neighborhood to stay in the neighborhood and live in an improved place. We're developing a range of tools to address affordability, and we're organizing those by these 5 categories. There's the specific housing programs, so programs to build or maintain affordable housing, regulatory options to protect existing affordability, zoning tools to help promote the delivery of new affordable units, so to increase that supply with potential specific targeted benefits to projects that are affordable to different levels of income. Looking at the funding mechanisms and making it possible for both for-profit and non-profit developers to deliver affordable projects, and then capacity building. So build the capacity of the organizations that are already working to deliver affordable housing, and the best example we have is the University Area CDC, to elevate their program to do more of what they're doing well now, and just help them expand both geographically and the number of units they're delivering to the market. The other part of this puzzle is to increase the diversity of the available kinds of units that are out there. So this is the spectrum of what we call missing middle housing. It's the kind of housing that falls between single-family units at one end of the spectrum and larger-scale multifamily at the other end of the spectrum. And between there's not a lot of options that exist in the neighborhoods now. There's not a lot of small-scale attached housing, which is one strategy to try to push affordability. There's not a lot of kind of unconventional organizations of projects, cottage courts, townhouse courts, not a lot of townhouses in the market, and very few live-work kinds of opportunities. So we're looking at the existing planning tools and zoning codes to see if we can promote a wider range of housing along the corridor and directly adjacent to the corridor. So the third question that we're looking at is how can we encourage development of underused and auto-oriented sites, bring new uses to the corridor, and ensure projects fit the surrounding neighborhoods. So what we're developing now is a planning tool to guide development and redevelopment along the corridor. So we're calling it the TOD place types. They would be a foundation for comprehensive plan policies and new zoning standards. They provide guidance about the appropriate form, scale, and character of development, with the idea that these are designed to tailor that development to fit different communities and different contexts. This is a map that indicates generally the distribution of the different place types along the corridor. So we're talking about three scales or kinds of centers, downtown, and downtown kind of speaks for itself because that's the largest scale development that we see along the corridor, but that would be isolated to the footprint of existing downtown. We have urban centers and TOD centers. These would be places that would allow for a little bit more density and intensity along the corridor to take advantage of some of the larger footprint development opportunities, but also bring some new uses and diversity to uses along the neighborhood. And then the smaller scale development, TOD corridor and TOD neighborhood. And so what I'll do now is walk through each of these a little bit more slowly and show you some examples of the scale of development and the character of development that we're talking about. So downtown is pretty straightforward, and a lot of the planning tools exist to guide development downtown. So this is all what occurs in downtown Tampa, south of I-275. And as you know, this is a very transit-rich environment now, with streetcar, with BRT, access to Marion Transit Center, and existing walkability, bikeability, micromobility options. This is a really easy place to get around without owning a car. We're talking about, continuing to support what's happening now, looking at the potential for infill and redevelopment of full blocks and partial blocks throughout the footprint of downtown, continuing a high mix of uses with active ground floor space, highly walkable streets and streetscapes. The second category is urban centers. So this is larger scale development. We're talking about this occurring only in a few locations along the corridor. We're looking at what occurs north of 275 to Palm Avenue as a location that can support a little increased density intensity. It's also on the proposed extension of the streetcar line, so it's almost as transit-rich of an environment as the core of downtown. The other locations are more suburban. So we're looking at suburban retrofit sites at Waters north of the river, and the University Mall property is a good example of the kind of development we're talking about, and then more employment-intensive locations at USF and the VA. So in these locations, we're talking about more intensive development of larger parcels, larger vacant and underutilized sites, planning for the phased development of some of those larger properties, and I'll show you a sketch about that in a second. Thinking about these as becoming community centers of higher intensity activity, higher density housing, education, and employment. The scale of development we're talking about is kind of like the Pearl or Heights Union near Armature Works. So mid-rise buildings with active ground floor uses, a mix of surface and structured parking behind the buildings, and as we talk about with all of these locations, improvements in walkability in streets and streetscapes. So this is a sketch that shows what would happen north of 275 and the potential that exists in that location. And then for the more larger scale suburban sites, and this is a sketch for what could happen south of Waters, is new buildings along the edge of new blocks and new streets with mid-block parking, nice walkable streetscapes, and the planning and coding that would allow for phased development over time. So as the market conditions improved, developments, this could be incrementally delivered across the full footprint of those large-scale vacant sites. And if you think about the key, one of the keys example is University Mall property, and that's how they're building out that site. The character of development is truly urban places. So these are larger scale buildings, active streetscapes, active storefronts, a range of building heights, but really the key is focused on the quality of the public spaces that these buildings define. The next center, so we talked about downtown, the urban centers, and now the TOD centers would be the next scale of development down from the urban centers. So more
Steve,
compatible with the neighborhood fabric. Yes.
Sorry, I know you're flowing here, but I think we have a couple questions that really pertain to the downtown area type TOD development. Okay. So one of our questions is, will minimum parking requirements in urban centers, TOD centers along the corridor be eliminated to encourage redevelopment and transit use? And then another question that ties in with that as well is, will you recommend parking ratios or let the market decide for each character?
So there, again, as we think about this, we're thinking about this as not a one-size-fits-all strategy. So the parking strategy would have to be calibrated to the location. One of the things that we're concerned about if we completely removed parking requirements or had highly reduced minimum requirements, we're concerned about the potential for spillover parking in the places where the corridor is right up against single-family residential neighborhood fabric. So where we don't have an opportunity for the street network or parking within a district to absorb any overflow, we're going to be really careful about the way we think about potential reductions. When we think about downtown, up to Palm Avenue, and possibly the more suburban sites that aren't adjacent to single-family neighborhoods, we think there's a possibility for an increased level of reduction, and we're starting to look at that now. So we've had discussions. I see one of these questions came from Karen at the Downtown Partnership. We've had discussions with Karen about some of the parking analysis that they've done, and that's one of the next steps in the process is to move into that a little more deeply.
Great, thank you.
And we'll come, Nicole's watching that chat, so we'll come back to these, circle back to some of these questions as they come in. I started to introduce the TOD center. So these are places where there's the possibility for slightly increased density at the primary stop locations. So these would be the places with direct access to the high capacity, high frequency stop locations along the corridor. We show a couple in Tampa Heights, a couple in Seminole Heights. We looked at the Floorland Mall site at Bush Boulevard, the larger scale suburban sites at Nebraska and Fowler, and at Fowler and 15th. So these are places that have the potential to really benefit from increased transit accessibility. So we're thinking about those as being defined as centers. The scale of development is 3 to 5 story buildings aligned along the sidewalks with a mix of surface and structured parking tucked behind. Thinking really carefully about how building heights transition to the surrounding neighborhood and the possibility for missing middle housing types as transitions to the existing single-family neighborhoods. So this sketch shows generally that scale of development that we're talking about. An example that exists on the corridor is the Heights project. So we've got a couple examples of buildings of that scale that exist along the corridor now. We looked both at, so the first sketch here is Florida Avenue frontage. So these are the ends of blocks, relatively small sites, so 1 acre sites, and they're kind of limited in their development potential just based on the land availability. And then on Fowler Avenue, we have much longer and deeper blocks, so we can get slightly larger buildings that can benefit from that accessibility to transit. this is the general character that we're starting to plan for and starting to think about code provisions to deliver. So more walkable, pedestrian-friendly, well-defined streets and streetscapes are really changing character from what exists now as the highly auto-oriented nature of much of the corridor. This would be these pulse points that felt like neighborhood centers and places where people could gravitate to meet their daily needs, introduce new living options and working environments. The next category is TOD corridors. This would be the places that would happen between the centers. So generally, the potential for infill and redevelopment of frontage sites between those pulse points along the corridor. These would be 2 to 4 story buildings, slightly smaller, generally less land available, so the intensity would be limited, primarily supported by surface parking. So we don't see these as being as intense as what happens at the centers. The next these images show the general scale that we're talking about. So again, 2 to 4 story buildings, more neighborhood character, still highly walkable, still a focus on the pedestrian realm and the way buildings meet the street. And then in the neighborhood, so this would be locations within walking distance of those primary stops. So we're starting to think about opportunities for small lot, single-family uses, the potential allowance for accessory dwelling units on existing sites, the possibility of some limited infill for attached housing and for townhouse housing. Similar scale to fit the neighborhood, similar kinds of setbacks, building-street relationships. So we want to have more discussion about folks' comfort level with this sort of change along the corridor. So that's the full picture or framework that we're starting to work from in thinking about the future of the corridor. So again, the 3 centers, downtown, urban center, and TOD, the 2 lower scale development TOD corridors, which would happen in between the circles on the map here in TOD neighborhoods. We're in the process of mapping that on a block by block, lot by lot basis, and we'll have that mapping available in the next several weeks, and that's one of the things that we'll share with you all when we get that a little further along. But for today, we want to test to see if we're headed in the right direction.
So, Steve, we have a couple of questions. Sorry, Michelle, I'm just going to share these questions
there's quite a few in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, so
do you want, Nicole, do you want Michelle just to give the instructions, and then we'll just kick off the
discussion
session?
Sure.
Okay, so just to recap what I went over before, we are now entering into the discussion portion of the presentation. I see we have a couple of questions in the chat, which is great. Looks like you guys figured that out. So the option we're adding to this portion is you can also raise your hand if you'd like to speak. So if you raise your hand, I can see that, and I'll call on people to talk, and I'll have to unmute you. But I think first maybe we'll go through some of these questions in the chat, because I don't see any hands right now.
Sure, Michelle. I can start off with some of the questions. One of our early questions, Steve, was, will road width have to be reduced or lanes removed to increase sidewalk width and add a buffer between the sidewalk and road?
Yeah, that's a great and really fundamental question to how things work along the corridor. There's been some analysis of what could occur along the full BRT corridor, the streetcar corridor and the streetcar extension and the BRT corridor through those studies. So we've looked at different alternative street sections for the downtown sections of Tampa and Florida. And then the HART, through their other consulting team, has looked at conditions north of there. So we're looking at where one of the first priorities is to see if we can take a lane out of service to benefit the transit use. So we're looking at a streetcar exclusive or a shared lane for streetcar and BRT downtown. And then to the north, we're looking at the potential for an exclusive lane for the BRT service on North Florida, potentially taking a lane out of service, then possibly moving it to the center, and then along Fowler, looking at center and side running BRT. So those possibilities exist. For the sidewalk, we either try to recapture space by reconfiguring the street, or we work with through zoning and other means to try to widen the sidewalks back into the private land. So we would look for an easement or additional right-of-way back of the curb line to create the conditions that exist, better conditions for sidewalks. And the Heights is an example. The Height project is an example where that occurred, where the building was set back a minimal distance to allow for a better streetscape condition.
Thanks, Steve. Our next comment is, I noticed that the TOD centers are also located near the least pedestrian-friendly intersections, like Hillsborough. Why not the more walkable locations like Hannah or Osborne?
So we're going through this exercise now where we're looking at it. We're working with HART's team to try to understand the optimal location for the transit stop, and we're trying to align that with the definition, the specific definition for the center. So I'll take for the example that is mentioned in the comment about Hillsborough. Hillsborough is not a great place for walking. It's not a nice environment. There's a lot of high-speed crossing traffic at that location. As we're looking at it now, we're looking at shifting that center location that's shown on the map now to the south, and we're working with HART to think about the optimal locations for the stops. So that question is a factor that we're addressing now as we're looking at it in more detail. So the framework gets us to the start of that, but we expect these circles to move back and forth as we start to map them more closely. So we are trying to take advantage of the transit accessibility as a way to get people out of their cars and onto transit, reduce parking demand and reduce vehicle miles traveled, vehicle trips overall and vehicle miles traveled. So that's a factor in thinking about the optimal locations for stops. So I appreciate that question. And when you look at the maps and when we get them mapped by parcel, you'll see how we've evolved from this preliminary framework.
And Steve, if I could jump in for 1 second. This is Justin Willits with HART. One of the other maybe more simple answers to that question is that for the attractiveness of federal funding for a major BRT capital project, we have to base a lot of the stations on existing ridership. So that's one of the reasons we need to capture that Hillsborough transfer. That's a major artery for transit riders and vehicle travel in the county and city. So that's another reason why we have to focus on some of those major intersections to have that transfer connectivity to some of our other services.
Thanks, Justin. Michelle, did you have anyone that had their hand raised, or I can continue with some of the chat questions?
I do not see any hands raised at this time.
Okay, so we have a question, Bob O'Malley. Are you looking to reduce lane width and or number of lanes to make the corridor more walkable and to use the extra space for BRT only lanes and or protected bike lanes? So I guess I can answer this a little bit, and then I will hand it over to you, Justin, as the BRT project manager. But Bob, we are definitely looking at changing the lane structures to allow for BRT. So that is definitely something that we have considered. And then I will hand it over to you, Justin, to give some more details on that.
Sure. I think Steve kind of touched on it, but on the larger sections where there are 3 lanes in one direction on the one-way pairs to the south of the corridor, we are looking to repurpose a general travel lane to transit only. And then further north on some of those larger 6 lanes, 2-way sections of Florida Avenue in Nebraska, we think there's a little bit of extra asphalt there that we can utilize. But the constrained section that Steve showed is the tricky part. We know that those sidewalks are totally inhospitable. You have to actually dodge side view mirrors. I was on one of them last week. It was not pleasant. But we know that potentially a 4-to-3 conversion to give a little bit more buffer space to the sidewalks, may be the better interim condition to make it a little more transit friendly. But we're going to have to balance those needs with the speed of operation for the BRT. But we know that, the community in that area has clamored for better transit service, but we have to create a pedestrian and bike-friendly environment to complement the transit service, because just operating a bus in that lane as we currently do is not very friendly to the pedestrians as it exists. So we're balancing a lot of those different needs. That constrained section is one of those things we're going to be tackling here soon in the PD&E study for the BRT.
Thanks, Justin. So our next question is, a big part of commercial street aesthetics deals with signage. Has this issue been addressed? And if so, what solutions will be implemented and enforced?
It's a great question. And we have, in addition to having the history of development typologies along the corridor, we also have the history of signage typologies along the corridor. So when you look at some of which some could argue are heritage signs at this point in their history, but there's the smaller scale signs for the early auto-oriented development that occurs in Tampa Heights and Seminole Heights along Florida. So you can see some of those are almost quaint compared to the scale of signage that we get on a corridor like Fowler. The primary focus is not on trying to address the aesthetics of those suburban corridors. It's trying to get the building form, get those buildings in the right place and make it more urban and walkable. So we're not specifically looking at adjusting signage regulations or improving the signage ordinance for the suburban locations. We're focused more on the ultimate goal, which is to convert those more suburban types of development to more urban forms of development, support higher levels of walkability, and then you wouldn't have the need for those large-scale signs in the future. But I think, the question could be something that the city and county tackle for land development regulation improvements, and we'll take that back to them for discussion. But our primary focus is on the form of new development and redevelopment.
Thank you, Steve. So we have a question from Allie A. Does the NOAA study quantify additional affordable units needed right now based on levels of housing cost burden in addition to what is currently out there for the units already occupied?
Can we bring Caitlin in for that? Caitlin, can I put you on the spot?
Yeah, of course. So our housing affordability assessment did not include the detailed demand analysis for housing needs in the long term as part of this scope of service. We really tried to inform our strategy using regional metrics of cost burden and housing balance, and then locally we looked at the affordability of the existing supply within the corridor and the extent to which the current market conditions may place upward pressure on housing affordability as transit is introduced along the corridor.
Allie, we do have the full housing report up on the website. So there's the broad, Caitlin, there's the broad definition of the existing disconnect between demand and supply. So we do indicate what the current condition is, but we haven't projected how that's going to change in the future.
Correct.
Okay, Michelle, I'm going to ask you if you have any hands raised again.
Nope, I don't.
Okay.
Surprisingly.
So I'll keep going then.
Sorry,
Karen,
Nicole. Yeah.
no problem. Karen Kress asks, do any of the stations function as a park and ride?
That's a great question and really easy to answer. The answer is no. We're not assuming that there's going to be drive-up traffic to support transit use along the corridor. Our plan is that these are walk-up stops supported by the neighborhoods and the development along the corridor. So there's, in no way are we looking at sites where park and ride lots could be constructed as part of our project.
Thank you, Steve. So we have a comment from Brian Seal, and his comment is, along commercial corridors, mixed uses of buildings, shade trees, and even covered walkways are crucial. Please ensure these standards are added to the code. So I think that's something that we agree with. We know that we want to have mixed uses. We know that the Florida heat, we definitely need some sort of shade and protection to the residents that are, trying to be outside and walking or walking to transit, things of that nature. So I definitely would say that our project supports all of these, Brian. Okay, so we have a question from Sherry Donahue. Will widespread zoning need to occur along this corridor? And if so, what is your desired timeline?
So we're working with the city and the county because along Florida, just off the frontage, we shift to Hillsborough County. So we're working with both the city and county to puzzle through that question now. Our general thinking right now is that a lot of what we're trying to accomplish could be handled with an overlay. So leave the existing base zoning alone and do adjustments with an overlay, which could possibly accelerate the time frame for that. So the city's looking at resources to advance the code writing process itself as we conclude and make our recommendations. But we're not 100% set on that direction yet. So right now we're testing to see where these changes would be appropriate, comparing what's in the comprehensive plan future land use categories to the zoning categories against this framework to see what kind of adjustments we need to make and where to focus.
Thanks, Steve. So we have another comment from Brian Seal. For residential areas, off-street parking minimums need to be reduced for single-family attached and small multifamily under 10 units. Excessive guest parking is required by code. The neighborhoods surrounding this transit corridor are all historic, and not all have historic design standards. All new developments need to be governed by strict design standards for compatibility.
Yeah, I'll take the sort of second part of that one first. When we talk about the TOD neighborhoods, we're talking about the locations where some change from single-family, exclusively single-family uses would be appropriate. And that would be accompanied by design controls which promoted compatibility. So that I don't think, with the where we're headed now anyway, they wouldn't be as strict as the kinds of scrutiny you get in the Tampa Heights and Seminole Heights historic districts, because you have to go before a review body that influences the directions of projects. But we would try to get some form-based provisions in the basic standards in an overlay that would help ensure higher levels of compatibility. And the places we're looking at, thinking about, are outside of the existing historic districts and those neighborhoods that are currently delivering a lot of the naturally occurring affordable housing, but are really vulnerable to change. And this project could accelerate that pace of change. So we want to make sure the controls are in place in those locations so people don't completely change the character of a relatively stable and affordable neighborhood.
Great, thanks, Steve. So we have a question from Sean Barodian, and I'm sorry if I butchered your name, Sean. The question is, will HART consider partnering with local private developers to add density and uses above stations? So, I guess I would answer this and say that our stations we're not building them to that capacity as yet that we would have uses above stations. So even with our planning, it doesn't look like that based on our TOD neighborhoods and centers. However, HART is never opposed to partnering. That's one of the things that we try to do with a lot of our projects. So it could definitely happen in the future at some point. I know with the BRT stations, they don't look like stations where we would have uses above.
Yeah, and Nicole, I would say the same thing about the streetcar stops, is that we've actually used the language, we call them stops instead of stations, because they're relatively light footprint improvements. So if you think about the existing streetcar stops, they're shelters, benches, a limited amount of amenities to support folks that are waiting for stops, but they're not large-scale kinds of stations that you see in a heavy rail metro kind of system or a commuter rail system. So we would we're generally thinking for streetcar that we would only need some slivers of real estate to allow for the stop footprint, and that wouldn't be enough to generate a joint development possibility or opportunity.
Okay, so we have a question from Karen Kress. Any thought of incorporating TDM requirements into the code, such as provided transit passes for all residents?
We haven't gone down to that level of detail yet in terms of the recommendations. But I think that that's part of the agenda when we think about how development along this corridor is different than other corridors. So we're looking at that higher level of urbanism, but there's also specific rationale for this change associated with transit. And if we can drive more riders to transit, that's part of what we're looking to do. On the flip side of that, Karen, one of the things that we're trying to be careful with is not to load more requirements on this corridor and chase some of those dollars elsewhere. So we want to make it really easy to do a high-quality TOD project here without stacking up a lot of requirements and hurdles on the development community. Because we don't, these projects here would be also good on Nebraska, also good on Hillsborough, also good on Bush. But we really want to try to focus this new investment along the corridor because we know we can reduce vehicle trips generated and convert some of those, which would have been vehicle trips to transit trips.
Great. Our next question is from Damien. Capital If Tampa continues to grow at the rate that it has in the prior decade, we will need to find homes for approximately 120,000 new people through 2035. Do we have a sense of how much capacity the place types being presented today provide?
We do not specifically yet, but that's a number we're going to generate once we look at the actual definition of apply these place types to specific real estate. So when we start to map this block by block, parcel by parcel, we can do an acreage takeoff and apply a build out to those numbers and see what the capacity is we can support. So right now we haven't, but we plan to, and we should have those numbers available. As you know, Damien, and this may be kind of in the weeds for some of the participants on the call, the regional planning model, which shows population employment projections for the region, already indicates a significant amount of development projected for this corridor under existing plan categories. Because this corridor includes downtown with significant, development potential, and the larger sites up by USF also with significant development potential. So there's already a lot projected for the corridor, and we'll be able to figure out more precisely what we think can actually be supported when we identify the actual locations for development and new development and redevelopment.
Great. So Robert Creighton asks, if everything goes according to plan, when will this project be completed? So we are actually looking at late fall this year for the completion of the recommendations for this project, Robert. Okay, so we have a question from Karen Kress. Thoughts on incentives the code could offer to encourage development along the corridor?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that real quick? I don't see that one.
Sure. Thoughts on incentives the codes could offer to encourage development along the corridor?
Let me combine that question with the comment from Brad Cook about the densities targeted for the study and the ability to achieve those densities.
Sure.
We've done a series of analyses both from a financial perspective and a design perspective to see what can fit on typical available sites in different locations along the corridor. So we've tested to see what the density ranges would be based on different parking requirements and assumptions about parking requirements. What happens if we reduce the standard? Can we squeeze more units on a property or more building space on a property? So we're calibrating really closely to what's realistic based on the generally small footprint of development potential, especially in Tampa Heights especially in Tampa Heights, Seminole Heights, and up on North Nebraska. So our recommendations and the densities that we're talking about now are tested through a series of design studies. We're also looking at the financial implications of those. Regarding incentives, so we're also testing from a financial standpoint what incentives do to the bottom line for projects. How do they affect return on investment? We've looked at different scales and kinds of projects. We've looked at different use mixes and tested the financial implications of changing parking requirements, density, use mix, and affordability. There's not a lot of room based on the existing future land use categories for significantly more density and intensity. So our recommendations are relatively in line with what the existing future land use categories allow for. Now, it doesn't mean that zoning allows for those maximums under the future land use category, so that's the next step that we'll look at is what the zoning provisions can deliver. But we are getting pretty close to maxing out the density intensity that we showed in these images that are consistent with the scale of the photographs that we showed. Based on full existing parking, 80% reduction, and even a greater reduction. So we're not too far away from achieving what we've indicated, even on a relatively small site. So we're looking at 1 acre sites along in Tampa Heights and Seminole Heights, and then we're looking at the larger sites along Fowler and in the suburban retrofit locations.
Thanks, Steve. So we have a question from Linda Walker. Big box shopping has gone out of business at centers around Waters and Florida Avenue. Could we spark some redevelopment? Is there some TOD possibility? Unsure of the current ridership.
Those sites are great sites for redevelopment over the long term. The market conditions aren't terribly strong right now, but if you think about the scale of the sites that are south of Waters on the west side and the east side, we're talking about properties that are the scale of Midtown on down Mabry. So that kind of development is definitely possible from a physical standpoint, but the market conditions aren't quite strong enough now to support that. So we want to put the right tools in place to allow that scale of development in the future and to allow that scale of development to be phased in over time. So when someone starts to build out the sites, they start to put the buildings in the right place to create a more walkable, transit-supported environment, and then can build out the rest of the property as it improves. Now, you asked the question about ridership. These particular locations are not generating a lot of transit ridership now. You've got employees in those businesses that may use transit, but we don't have a lot of residential density or employment density to support high ridership now. So this is more of a longer-term possibility, and what we want to do is make sure that investment that does occur there doesn't continue that auto-oriented pattern and low employment and low housing intensity pattern.
Okay, we have a question from Clarence Ng. Can you further describe your upcoming evaluation of the station areas, place types at the parcel level? How much will it or not consider FLU, ownership, size, etc., when considering scale, form, etc.?
Yeah, so we're working through that mapping exercise now, looking at these categories and mapping the limits of these categories. And to some extent, Clarence, as you know, it's relatively straightforward because we know what the edges of the neighborhoods are, and we're not looking at expanding back into the neighborhoods to any great extent. So we're trying to hold the line between what's corridor and available for redevelopment and what's neighborhood behind it. And then that gives us the scale of opportunity. We know, like, based on lot depth, on the existing pattern of use, we're comparing that to the existing future land use category, and we are looking at ownership patterns. Ownership is probably one of the things that is going to keep the lid on the pace of development because there's not a lot of large-scale single-owned sites separate from the larger-scale suburban properties. So when we look at ownership patterns south of the Hillsborough River, and then same kind of approach along Nebraska. We see a lot of fragmented ownership. There's not a lot of, doesn't appear to be, based on looking at ownership records, a lot of consolidation over time. We might see the block frontage, but people haven't bought up all the lots behind it. So it's somewhat constrained by the ownership pattern. But we are looking at that as we're doing this mapping. So if you come back to the website in a few weeks, you'll see the first cut at that map. We have to work with the city and the county before we release those for review by the community, but we're heading down that path, and we'll send everybody on these calls an update about when that material is available.
So we have a follow-up question, Steve, to our signage question from Beatrice Bear. And the question is, or comment, is that she did not notice any business signs in any of the after photo renditions. So I think she was just trying to clarify that signage is a part of the TOD strategy.
It is when we get down to that level of detail. The thing is that for this study, we're just getting the sort of the building blocks in place to support redevelopment. The specific details about the signs and sign scale and sign type, as well as questions about architectural styles and features, and some of those details would be worked out by the city following this study. So that level of detail would be a follow-on effort.
Great, thank you. So we have a follow-up to one of Karen Kress's comments or questions from Clarence Eng. Are you considering the FDOT Intermodal Center study efforts? There is some park and ride components. I mean,
Sorry, Nicole, did you want to tackle that?
I was just going to say that the park and ride is kind of out of our study area while we're looking at local and regional connections. We really aren't focused on that area. Did you want to add to that, Steve?
No, I was going to, there's the, based on my understanding, and if I may have missed something, we can definitely do more homework, but those locations haven't landed and haven't been very well defined yet, so we are not trying to do that project's work for them at this stage. So this system is designed around the assumption that service to the corridor, service for the streetcar and the BRT line would be primarily walk-up, access to stops, and we're looking at the development opportunities to help increase and build that base of ridership for the system. So our assumptions don't rely on park and ride, and in some cases I think a significant park and ride along the corridor would be go counter to what we're thinking about in terms of walkability and access to transit.
Thank you. Okay, so from Bob O'Malley, we have, has there been any discussion about pursuing legislative policy changes to enable HART to capture the incremental increase in property taxes that may result from redevelopment along the corridor or around the stations? So I guess I will answer that, Bob. Right now, specific to this project, we are not looking at the increase in property taxes and how that may or may not impact HART. We have not looked at changing legislative policies or anything like that with future increases in property taxes. Okay, so we have another. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I think Bob raises an important question about the value capture potential for this. So there's a couple different, there's the existing community redevelopment area mechanism that would allow for tax increment revenue to be used to support both improvements in transportation, mobility, and other sorts of improvements along the corridor. Right now, we haven't evaluated that in any great detail, but we'll be documenting what that possibility is. And then we'll be working with the city to talk about that. Now, specifically as a transit benefit TIF, that would require, changes in state legislation. Right now, we're not assuming that's going to occur, but it's part of the background discussion, definitely.
Okay. So we have another question from Bob, and this is stops versus stations. How do you create a sense of permanence to give private investors enough comfort that their TOD investments will always be served by transit?
I'll flip quickly back up. We did show a sketch, so this is a bit of a placeholder sketch now for the arterial BRT project. I think I had it in here, yeah. This is the level of the stop improvement that we're talking about. So this is a similar scale of investment as occurred for the Metro Rapid system along Nebraska. If you think about the footprint and the nature of the improvement, we're talking about a similar kinds and types of improvement for the streetcar stops along downtown. And I think eventually in design, those two things should be brought together. So you're not looking at two different kinds of systems, but they're really two parts of the same broader system. But this is the level of improvement that we're talking about. So there would be the guideway improvements, Bob, and that exclusivity, I think, is one of the biggest indications of commitment to transit service over time in the corridor. And then we'll see these scales of stop improvements. But in terms of anything more elaborate or more capital intensive, that's not where the projects are headed now.
Okay. Okay, so we have a question from Damian Miller. Robles Park isn't showing up as a center, but it's one of the bigger pieces of real estate between the river and downtown. How is the TOD study interfacing with the Housing Authority's ongoing planning work there? Has there been any discussion of bumping up the density in their plan to make this area more transit supportive?
Yeah, Demi, and that's one of the things that we're in this mapping exercise when we move beyond kind of this broad framework into more careful planning, that we would pick up the Robles Park site. Let me get to my big summary map, which is the property here in the southeast quadrant of MLK. This is another case where we're showing our circle straddling the interchange, but we would slide it south and include Robles Park in that footprint for the TOD center scale. I haven't looked at the latest plan, so I'm not sure what density they're hitting, but we would be looking at pretty significant density and intensity for their site, and would want to calibrate where we head with this mapping exercise with their plans and try to push them for even more density. One of the challenges is those in-between properties are fairly isolated along the corridor frontage itself. But we have had preliminary discussions with them. We want to take this mapping exercise back to them over the next month and crank that back up again.
Great. So we have a comment from Clarence, and the comment is, agreed, was just trying to see how far you were going for context. There is a property owner who is waiting to see what may happen. So just sharing that comment. We have a comment from Ms. Overman, and the comment is TIF financing for HART operation and reinvestment for development and infrastructure costs. Okay, so we have a question from Allie. Allie, hopefully I don't butcher your name, Ankudowicz. Is there a risk of pricing out certain potentially desirable types of non-residential uses, such as small local businesses, and is this considered in strategies for area types?
Yeah, Allie, that's something that we have assistance from SB Friedman and Associates as well as Street Sense to look at the impacts of the project on existing businesses and well as the potential mix of development along the corridor. There is definitely the potential for displacement of some of the smaller businesses at these center locations specifically. And we haven't puzzled through yet what strategies might be appropriate to help them either hold on to what they have or to find a place in new projects or in a different location along the corridor. One of the challenges that we have to a large extent is what some folks might define as a heritage business that has been along the corridor for 40 or 50 years. A large percentage of those are auto-oriented uses that we're not interested in protecting, that aren't transit supportive, that don't provide specific services to the surrounding neighborhood. A lot of those legacy businesses are here primarily because they've paid off their land, and it's an easy place for them to be. But we'd like to see those transition. So finding a balance between what we sort of push to transition and what we keep is tricky. And we'll be looking at that when we develop our more detailed recommendations about redevelopment.
Okay, Steve, those are all the questions I have so far. They were great questions. Thank you all so much. Please feel free to share more if you like, or as I said, raise your hand and then we can unmute you and get those questions out.
Yeah, we have, just as a time check, we're 5:17, we'll end by 5:30. So we've got room for a couple more questions before we go to our closing slides, and they'll be pretty quick. So if there's anything additional we can answer, we can now. We'll, in the closing slides, I don't want to get too ahead of us, but we will be reminding you to check out the website, to use the website as a way to get in touch with us. And we've also introduced a survey on the website so you can provide a little more feedback to us on where we're heading with the study.
So Steve, we have one more question from Clarence. In the calibration, how far will you go to max versus market conditions?
That's one of those tough questions. What we're going to start with is looking at the maximum potential development that we think is compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. So it's not kind of a theoretical maximum. It's going to be calibrated by the adjacencies. So along the Tampa and Florida frontage, we may be thinking kind of aggressively about density, but if we can't fit it on those small frontage sites, we're going to pull that down. So we're actually defining something that can be delivered under basic, the market conditions now, as well as the physical development opportunity that exists. So as exists now with the future land use categories, there's a lot more future land use development potential that's been identified and mapped than the market can deliver right now, but it creates that sort of headroom for the market to move back and forth along the corridor and meet community needs. So we'll be defining a land use strategy that's more than what the market can deliver now, but provides high levels of flexibility in how those projects are delivered over time.
Great, thank you, Steve. At this point, we have one question that just came up. So Brad Cook has a question for us. When you are assessing what kind of densities and parking can be accommodated, are you assuming that assemblage of lots will be utilized rather than the current fragmented property ownership?
The quick answer is generally yes. But however, that's a relatively modest assemblage. If we're thinking about the frontage along in Tampa Heights, Seminole Heights, and up to the north along Nebraska, we're only talking about an assemblage of an acre to an acre and a half total, and that may require a couple property owners to cut a deal to advance that scale of a project. We're not talking about someone that will take down a full block and may need to try to cut a deal with eight or 10 property owners. So we're assuming some assemblage as we draft the requirements, with the understanding that not all of those will be assembled and not all will achieve the maximum density allowed under the plan. So we're trying to build in some incentive for assemblage, but not go overboard with that and require a significant footprint to move the project forward. And Nicole, we're at 5:21, so do you want to take us to the closing?
Sure, I will. If we can have our next slide, please. Great. So, we've had some really good discussion, some great questions today that will have us thinking in different ways and looking at our strategies to see what will work, what won't. We are so glad to hear from you guys. We wanted to thank everyone for coming out today and really participating. You guys have really generated some great discussion. So our next steps for this study, we do have a survey that's a follow-up actually to this workshop. It'll be available through June 18th, and it'll really ask you guys some more questions, some more detailed questions about what you want to see in the study area. So I encourage you to check it out on our TOD website, which is goharttod.org. We are going to continue to refine our strategies and recommendations. So we will, once that is completed, we'll also prepare a plan for the Palm Avenue Station area, and then we'll finalize the project in the fall of this year, 2021. So because you signed up and registered for the workshop, we will be sending out project updates, so you'll get those in your email, which will be great. And again, we just want to thank you guys for participating. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows you, gives you an idea of what our website looks like. Again, it's goharttod.org. So please take a look, and our survey will be on the website. Next slide, please. And we just want to thank you again. Our contact information is listed here. Please feel free to contact us with follow-up questions or ideas or concerns. We'll be glad to hear from you. Thank you all for participating this evening.
Great, thank you all. And just a quick reminder, this has been live streamed. It'll be available on YouTube, so if you want to share this with other folks, please, you'll be able to do that through that method. You can also ask them to sign up for tomorrow's workshop. So we're running the same basic script and agenda for tomorrow, a little bit later in the afternoon. So if you have some folks you think this would be interesting or useful for, please give them a heads up and have them join us tomorrow. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you all.